It's time for the Newsmaker Show on News Talk AM 1480 WLEA. Here's Kevin Doran.
Ryan O'Neill in for Kevin Doran on today's Newsmaker Show. On with Assemblyman Phil Palmesano. Assemblyman, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be with you, Brian.
Assemblyman Palmesano, one of Governor Andrew Cuomo's aides was shot in Brooklyn recently. The aide was an attorney in the governor's office. I believe assistant counsel was the title. The aide is now in critical condition in a New York City hospital. The governor says he wants more gun control. He said that right away. Wondering, Assemblyman Palmesano, do you know if the governor wants to put some amendments into the New York State SAFE Act?
Well, first, before I address that, certainly, Brian, to this young man and his family, our thoughts and prayers go out to him. It's just something that shouldn't happen, and it is certainly a tragedy. Seeing the comments that I heard the governor make, it seemed like he was trying to direct that more towards federal, as far as federal legislative action on this issue. But certainly, whenever you have something like this happen, you will see calls for more gun control measures. And quite frankly, I just don't think that's the answer to solve these problems. Even during the whole SAFE Act debate and discussion, when you look at the statistics that we were trying to bring forth to make our case against it, 90% of the crimes committed with a gun in New York State, these guns are illegally obtained from out of state. So what more gun control does is really it penalizes law-abiding citizens to protect themselves and their families, and is going to do nothing to keep the guns out of the hands of criminals. I haven't seen any proposals being floated yet to make more stringent gun laws in New York State beyond the SAFE Act, although there are individual proposals out there that have been out there for years, and there are people who I serve with, particularly from downstate to urban areas, that like to see more gun control. But I know I'm committed to, and I know a number of my colleagues, in our area, specifically, Joe Giglio and Bill Noljay and Tom O'Mara, Kathy Young. We do not want to see more gun control in the books. So we need to, continue our push my hopes to repeal the SAFE Act in the future.
Governor Cuomo is also pushing for minimum wage to be raised to $15 an hour. There's a story connected to that $15 an hour that he wants for restaurant workers who work for the bigger restaurant chains. First, I want to ask you about the chain restaurant $15 an hour proposal. What's going on with that?
Well, you remember maybe a couple months ago when the governor convened a wage board, a 3-person wage board, to evaluate the minimum wage for fast food workers at some of these chain restaurants, the McDonald's, the Burger King, and the like. This wage board came out with a recommendation a couple months ago to saying that they would recommend a minimum wage for employees in those facilities to make $15 an hour, phased in over a certain period of time, but $15 an hour nonetheless, which is an over 50% increase of current minimum wage. When the governor made his announcement recently, that had to be approved by the labor commissioner. And a lot of my colleagues and myself have been very critical because it's basically bypassing the legislature to increase the wage and put this mandate on businesses without legislative approval. So the wage board made that recommendation, and then recently when the governor was pushing for the statewide minimum wage, at that point in time, he announced that the labor commissioner, who had the authority to implement that or change it, announced that they were going to accept that wage recommendation for $15 an hour for fast food workers to be phased in, which is going to be a tremendous hit to small businesses.
Are you hearing from any businesses locally on that? You don't have to name names.
Yeah, I have heard, and really a lot of this discussion, Brian, started months ago. I met with some area restaurant owners because we were talking about the minimum wage for tip workers for some restaurant owners, not chain restaurants. And we were talking about how this wage board was used to make this recommendation for tip workers at the same, previously. And for tip workers, you're going to see beginning in January a 50% increase from $5 an hour to $7.50 an hour for tip workers. This is just another example of a cost shift to a business. And in some of these instances, these tip workers were making in some of these restaurants, a good wage. And the problem I have with it, especially by using these wage boards, they're unelected bodies, they're appointed, and then the labor commissioner has the ability to just, buy via order to increase the minimum wage, circumventing the legislature's approval. From those discussions I had put in legislation and gotten some sponsors and have shared that with others. That said, if there is going to be any such wage board making a recommendation, number one, any recommendation that comes forward would have to be unanimous, meaning all three individuals would have to support it. And then that would just be a recommendation that would go to the labor commissioner to review, and then he can make the recommendation to the legislature. But any wage increase that would take place for any area would have to be approved by both houses of the legislature and signed into law by the governor, because at least there's accountability from a local legislator to their constituency to deal with these issues, so there's some accountability. With an unelected labor commissioner or an unelected wage board, there's no accountability there. And quite frankly, I just think this is the wrong way to go. It's circumventing the legislature, in my opinion, taking that type of approach. And I think it's detrimental. And I think you're going to ultimately see what you're going to have happen is you're going to see more and more people, low-skilled workers, lose their jobs. And a lot of these fast food worker jobs are from teenagers and high school kids under the age of 25 working in these institutions. So those jobs aren't going to be available in the future, in my prediction, because of this. And because you can't just continue to shift the cost to a small business and expect them to absorb that cost and continue to grow their business and grow jobs. That's a tremendous increase in their bottom line.
You talked a moment ago about these agencies and panels and commissions that are set up in Albany by the governor. I have to say on that, the people I know who don't vote, they always say the reason that they don't vote is that they cannot elect. He says you can elect these officials, but then they set up these agencies and panels and commissions. So you're hitting on a big point with voter disillusionment there.
Well, no question about it. I think, first of all, I think, everyone should vote. And I understand why people are frustrated, but, Brian, we live in the greatest country in the world. You have some countries that don't have the freedoms that we have. We have people who have went over in harm's way and lost their lives to protect that freedom that we all have. So I understand the frustration and the anger with politics and government in general, but my challenge to those individuals is get involved, be engaged. Don't just sit on the sidelines and not vote. Speak up and make your voice heard, and hold your elected officials accountable. But I always have a concern when people say they don't vote, and I get that frustration. But you think about the young men and women who went in harm's way and lost their lives over the decade to preserve this incredible freedom and right that we have that is not allowed in other countries. And I think if people start to think of it in that way, they might hopefully take a better approach about getting engaged. But that doesn't change the fact that when you continue to put up these panels and not including the legislature, which is a part of that governing body, part of the Constitution, and just think you can increase the wage because you think it's the right thing to do, some of these people, I'm not sure what the labor commissioner's background is, but I'm not sure if he understands what it is to run a restaurant or a business, or the governor for that matter as well.
When you say that, Assemblyman Palmesano, I wasn't encouraging people not to vote. I was saying the people I know that don't are exasperated with bureaucratic agencies that have no accountability, that they cannot stop when an agency or a commission from doing something that they don't like. And I'm wondering, Assemblyman Palmesano, is this a widespread view among Republicans or even Democrats in Albany that they don't like all these panels and commissions, which are, you seem to say, set up so that Governor Cuomo can get his way on things when he doesn't think the legislature is going to go his way?
Well, I think the commission could be useful depending on how you use it and who's part of it, and what type of control or non-control they do have. We've seen examples, I think, in some instances where it was successful with the Medicaid redesign. We brought in stakeholders from all the factions to kind of make some recommendations. But I also seen it where it was an abysmal failure with things like the Mandate Relief Council, which did nothing, absolutely nothing. But sometimes you don't need commissions to address this issue. There's some common sense legislation out there that can address these problems if people just want to view it. But to take the approach that the governor's had on some of these issues and say, listen, I'm not getting what I want, so I'm going to use this panel to do it, and not allow the legislature to weigh in, I think is problematic. And we've seen different aspects of that be done, and he seems to go to these panels and commissions on more so than I've seen in the past. And and you wonder how much he's weighing in on that and controlling that from his perspective, especially if he's the one making the appointments. So now, if there's other people who can make the appointments to these commissions and have an input, that's one thing. But when he's controlling the whole process, how independent is this actually going to be?
You talk about commissions and panels. The governor wants a new review panel to look into the Common Core problems. He issued a statement saying that Common Core is not working in New York State, and he wants a panel to take 6 months to figure out what's wrong, and then he'll address it in his State of the State speech in January. What's the latest on this review panel?
Well, I haven't seen much detail beyond the statement he made, but when he did make a statement, I was pleased that he actually recognized that this is a problem. This is something, I've been talking about and my colleagues have been talking about for nearly the past couple of years. You remember when we had a public hearing in Corning in December, and when nearly 300 people from around my assembly district showed up and listened to testimony for over 5 hours, from parents, teachers, students, administrators, questioning the problems that they've seen with this. We know that the implementation of it has been an absolute disaster, but there's also been a number of problems along the way. And I think that has transitioned this growing opt-out movement we've seen with these standardized state testing that's being put on our kids in our schools. And what I've said all along is one of the reasons why we've seen such a growing opt-out movement, it really comes back to the fact that when our previous education commissioner, who is now at the federal level, when the concerns were being raised, legitimate, heartfelt concerns from parents and educators and teachers and administrators and students about Common Core, he didn't listen. He said, I have it under control. You just go back and you just deal with what you know. Well, that's what started this backlash. I mean, this has been not a movement by, some people say the teachers' unions has driven this movement. This has been a parent grassroots movement of parents and educators and students and who have expressed concerns about how this thing was rolled out, but problems with the curriculum, problems with local control and where things were going, and that's what has brought us to this point. And I'm glad that the governor has recognized this as a problem. We have offered, the thing I was really proud about with our conference is we have led on this issue. From those hearings, we actually listened to people, and we developed solid proposals that are, some of them have been moved forward already, and some are still out there to use to address this issue. The question I had when I saw the statement is this another panel that the governor is going to control, or is it going to really truly take into account input from stakeholders from across the state, from special education teachers to elementary education teachers to our math and science to a broad range of expertise, or is it just going to be a bunch of bureaucrats making a decision? That's where my concern is in this. Now, at the end of the day, I think we're going to need some legislative action to kind of direct this. I'm open to listen to where they go on this area, and I'm glad that the governor is at least taking this approach versus, basically saying that I'm going to continue to support this. I've said over and over again, I'm for higher standards, the pathway to get there. And there's been a lot of questions raised about Common Core and the pathway and the things associated with it. And, when you have that many concerns and red lights being raised on an issue, you don't go full speed ahead. You slow down and you pause and review. And that's what we've been saying all along. So we're glad people are starting to listen to that, and hopefully we can slow down on some of this. But also, I also am very concerned about this overuse of these standardized tests. Brian, I'm not going to get out of my head from attending a public forum where a young student was being interviewed by, young students were interviewing themselves, and this one young lady said, I feel like my self-worth is being measured by how I do on this test. That's wrong. We have to make sure as this process moves forward that we continue to treat parents as partners in this process, we treat our teachers as professionals, and we make sure that our students self-worth is not measured by how they do with the number 2 pencil on a standardized test at any given point in time. We want to have the best education system in the world for our kids, and we're going to do that by working together and not by dictating from the federal and state level this is the way to do things. We need input from our local stakeholders. We need to talk to those people, especially when you think about kids with disabilities and how continue to require them to take these tests, which they're going to struggle with, they're not going to be successful with, and putting such a focus on these tests and then translating that into evaluations for our teachers. That's where all these problems are. We need to take a step back and really start thinking what's in the best interest of our children and their education to help them grow and learn and move into the future so they can be competitive across this country and across the world.
Yeah, connected to Common Core, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Assemblyman, connected to Common Core is the No Child Left Behind funding?
Good. That's correct. I think, Common Core was the race to the top funding, and that's over with. But the No Child Left Behind, which was started back, I think, 2001, 2002, and they started to roll out, it requires this, continuation of all these tests through grades 3 through 8. I think that's something that we continue to push back on. I think that, the federal government, they're reviewing those process, that whole program now. And I think that's where you get a lot of concerns raised by parents and educators, just continued focus on standardized testing. I think there's testing serves its purpose, Brian, when it helps to gauge instruction, but when it's just used to evaluate and assess, when teachers and parents and students can't see the test questions so they can kind of gauge on where they need to learn and improve upon, when it's just given a score of a 1, 2, 3, or 4, that's something that we need to address. And we need help at the federal level, too, to require this ongoing testing just to compare and evaluate how one school versus another. I get there's a purpose for that to some degree, but not this over-reliance on this testing over and over again and putting so much stress on our kids and our teachers and our families. There's got to be a better way to do it. I don't think it's been working the way it has been, and I think we can certainly improve our education system for our kids without having this over-reliance on this standardized testing, which does nothing to measure the relationship between a student and child and the teacher and child in the classroom, or how a child with disabilities is progressing throughout the course of the year, and age-appropriate and development-appropriate testing for these kids. There's a lot of problems that need to be addressed. And the only way you're going to get at them is if you really listen to our local people who are in the classroom with our kids and our special education committees and our administrators at the local level to get their input. You just don't need bureaucrats in Washington saying this is the way it's going to be, because that's not the way it works. That's not always successful. A local control, local input system, a ground-up, grassroots approach up, I think is going to be a better way to really transcend our education system, because sometimes it's not a one-size-fits-all mentality, and that's what we have to be cognizant of in developing education policy across our state, across our country.
Do you work on strategies with Congressman Tom Reed, he in Washington and you in Albany? Do you ever talk to him and say, I want to do this to fight Common Core? Because I know Reed's against Common Core, too. Do you ever say, have those sorts of conversations with him on what he'll do in Washington and what you want to do in Albany?
Sure, we talk, and that's one thing I think I really our guys, from Tom and Tom O'Meara and myself, Bill, we communicate on a regular basis, and even on this education issue, Tom Reed and I have spoken, and he took what we've done at the local level, state level, where we have legislation in that says if parents opt out of these tests, obviously they have the right to opt out. There will be no penalty, from the federal, no penalties to our students for opting out of our class, which means we shouldn't have kids sitting in the classroom staring while people around them are taking a test, or rewards for kids who do take the test and not for the other kids. There should be no penalties for teachers. If their kids are opting out of the test, that could dramatically affect their evaluation. That should not be a negative impact on that teacher and principal's evaluation. And then also for the school districts, because funding is tied to it. There should be no penalty for school districts to lose funds if they have kids opting out of those tests. And Tom Reed, he heard that, and he actually developed legislation at the federal level to do the same thing that we're trying to do at the state level. And earlier in the summer, you saw comments, we talked about it, Brian, where the new education commissioner was saying, well, there could be penalties for school districts, financial penalties, and people spoke up about that at the federal level, at the state level, and now you see the regents are saying, we're not going to penalize schools. The governor is saying, we're not going to penalize schools because of choices their parents make, and that's a wise decision. This is about parents taking back control of their child's education. So yes, I do talk to Tom on issues, especially on a local matter, and when we see each other. And then I think he's certainly shown that he's a leader on this issue and in a number of issues, particularly on this one. I know that's one of the issues that are being discussed as we move forward in reviewing the federal education policy and how that's going to implement state and local school districts. So yes, Tom is definitely attentive to this issue. He's well versed in it, and he's certainly a leader in listening and responding accordingly.
We're talking with Assemblyman Phil Palmesano. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back in segment 2, I'm going to get Assemblyman Palmesano's take on former CNN personality Campbell Brown and her lawsuit on teacher tenure. We'll continue this conversation, which is now focusing on education, in just a moment. Stay with us. Back on the show, Newsmaker Show, Brian O'Neill filling in for Kevin Doran today. Assemblyman Phil Palmesano is our guest. Assemblyman Palmesano, Campbell Brown, she's filed a lawsuit to change the rules of teacher tenure. Do you think that lawsuit will go anywhere, and should it go anywhere?
I don't know where the lawsuit's going to go, Brian. I know that there's been some changes that have been made to teacher tenure in New York State. And I think, listen, teachers aren't afraid. When you talk to teachers, I meet with teachers on a regular basis throughout my district. Teachers aren't afraid to be reviewed and evaluated. The problem is when you have so much of their evaluation being put in standardized testing. One of the things we talked about was their teacher review from their outside peers. You've seen people like the governor want to say we're going to have people from the outside come in and do these reviews of these teachers. The problems with things like that, Brian, is you can have an outside evaluator come in, but they don't know the dynamics of the relationship between that teacher and that student in the classroom on that given day, or how many kids with disabilities that teacher might have in the classroom. And when you continue to put so much focus, and I hate to keep going back to the standardized testing and evaluation, but that's such an central component of a teacher's success, because so much is being weighed on how they do on these evaluations, which kind of goes more forward in saying whether they're deemed effective or not effective as a teacher, which affects their tenure. I think teachers want accountability. I think the whole point of tenure is and challenges to tenure is to make sure you get bad teachers out of the classroom. And when you talk to teachers, they don't want the bad teachers in the classroom, and there's got to be a better process that we can have, and I think giving more flexibility to the states to do some of this thing would be an ideal thing to do. Reforming the system where, if there's a teacher who's doing bad things, not so a school district has to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to remove that teacher through a 4020A process. So there's things we can do to improve the process, and I think hopefully we'll continue to move forward to addressing that, because we want good teachers in the classroom, but we need to make sure, this evaluation system and this overemphasizing on standardized testing and the way it's being weighted to affect teachers' evaluations, I think, is wrong, and those things we need to address, and that's going to help. If we can address those things, I think that's going to smooth out some of the other problems that we've seen in the past.
Assemblyman Palmesano, you talk about a problem that I've heard about from local teachers, this hyper-testing mentality that comes down from the state, where the students have to be tested constantly and the teachers have to be constantly evaluated. I don't remember being constantly tested in those kinds of tests. I don't think you do either. This is sort of a newer thing. Where did all of this come from, this let's test?
Well, part of it is from the federal government. The No Child Left Behind federal plan that was brought into place to try to, the goal, I think, was to make sure there's accountability in the classroom, and that's good. You want accountability in the classroom. I think where they've gone off track, and what they do is they do this testing for grades 3 to 8. It's a mandate from the federal government, and my thoughts are it's not working. It's time to, let's go back and review that. And I know that's what they're looking at the federal level. But at state level, I think we need to start pushing back and saying, you know what, because we've asked for waivers for some of these tests, especially for kids with disabilities. And the federal government said no. My opinion should be to the federal government, if you're not going to allow us this waiver, then we're not going to listen to you, money or no money, because we're putting some of these kids, especially these kids with disabilities, through not the right process. It's not doing anything to further their education. So I think we need to do more on this standardized, hyper-sensitive standardized testing that's done over and over again, strictly to evaluate the child, strictly to evaluate a teacher, and strictly to evaluate, how a school district's doing. There's better ways to do that, And I think all this focus, that's why we do need help at the federal level. And I know Tom's pushing on that end, but I think you have an administration that's pretty happy with the way things are going. And like I said, you have the former education commissioner in New York State, one of the deputy secretaries under Ernie Duncan, and they like this use of standardized testing as a measurement and evaluation. I think we need to look at that and see there's got to be a better process moving forward. But if this testing is going to be out there, it shouldn't be considered as such a high percentage of evaluating students, teachers, and school districts. There's got to be a better way to kind of get truer results than just this over-focus on standardized testing, which, again, in my opinion, does nothing to measure that relationship between the student and child in the classroom and how that child is progressing just by how they do on a test on any given day.
Assemblyman Phil Palmesano, we're out of time. Great having you on this morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate your time.
And ABC is next on AM 1480 WLEA Hornet.